crazy, man?
Yo, it's Gio. Welcome back to my channel. And I did kinda read the most disturbing books during Holy Week. And it was the most depraved, most vile, most disgusting books in the planet Earth. Okay? So, Monday. We started off with a bang on Monday. Like, I started off with the most disgusting, most vile book, and that is Hogg. So, I've learned about this book through Juan Valencia. He has a series on his channel where he recommends the most disturbing books. And I discovered this book through him. And I want to say that I want to unfriend him because of this book, because I want to unread this. So basically, I'm not gonna urge you to read this because this is just the most vile book you could imagine. Any disgusting thing you can imagine, the book has it. The book was like checking all of the most disgusting things you could imagine. The book has it. This has pedophilia, this has sexual abuse, anything you could imagine, the book has this, okay? I also forgot to say that this book has incest, violence, and racial slurs, some basic things. As I said, I'm not gonna recommend this book. Read this book at your own risk. So if you don't want to get spoiled in this book, I'm gonna rate everything that happened into this book. It feels weird to rate this either a 1 star or any star rating because it's just the most vile stuff you could read. It doesn't even have a plot. Anything vile you could imagine. The author is like, just write it down. And I can't believe this book was published because of just the depravity of this book. Watch at your own risk because I'm gonna spoil the entire book. So let me divide the book into 3 acts. Okay, so imagine this book as a movie and it's divided into 3 acts. So the first act is we follow our narrator who doesn't have a name. He's a kid and he is being sold as a prostitute by his friend called Pedro. And on top of that, Pedro has a sister and he also sells his sister as a prostitute, who, by the way, let me add, is underage. So Pedro gets a quick buck from gang bikers who is raping Pedro's sister. And Pedro's sister likes it. Also, this unnamed kid who is being called sucker by the entirety of this book. Let me just call him Kerr, short for sea sucker. He likes sucking the C word, and it feels weird to say this, but he swallows. Let me just preface that. That is just the entire first act. So Kerr, Maria being sold as a prostitute by Pedro, and you would think Pedro is making a buck, but no. He's just earning like $2 or $3. I guess that's big back then. And one time, Pedro's father finds out about, Pedro's little side hustle, and you would think his father would beat Pedro up and prevent it from happening again, but his freaking father rapes Pedro's sister Maria. Make it make sense, okay? Make it make sense. So that is the entire first act. I was like, wow, I was just like, just wow, how really, it's really disturbing. Future me was like,
You think that's disturbing?
that's just the icing on top of a cake, okay? We have a whole lot to discuss. So the second act is Kerr was like wandering into an alleyway when he sees this guy who is beating a woman. After beating the woman, he rapes the woman and he's letting the woman suck his schlong, and after that he pisses on the woman and lets the woman drink his urine, and Kerr watches it in fascination. Okay, he's like watching it go down, and then this guy finds out that Kerr is watching, and so he calls Kerr and lets Kerr suck his, and lets Kerr drink his piss. And as Kerr was narrating, he drinks the piss and he described it as salty and kind of bitter, and he swallows the C word. We now know that this guy is named Hogg, and so he likes Kerr, obviously, because Kerr does the swallowing, and that's a freaking thunder. And he takes Kerr on his cab, and so they drive around. They stop by this suburban neighborhood, and this business guy walks in and says,
Have you done the job?
and Hogg is like,
Yes, we did the job, and this little guy gonna help me out.
and he embraces Kerr, and the business guy pays Hogg for the job, and that job was to, guess what, beat and rape the woman up. So Hogg and Kerr go into a restaurant, they eat, and based on Kerr's description, Hogg doesn't bathe, he doesn't wash himself whenever he takes the number 2, and yeah, his nails were freaking greasy, his hair is freaking greasy, and they are in the diner, right? And so they eat, but Hogg doesn't use utensils. He eats with his hands. Now, Filipinos also eat with our hands. It's better to eat with hands, you know. Rice, some fish, some pork, you know, kind of like a boodle fight, but we wash our hands, okay? We freaking wash our hands. But Hogg doesn't. And his hands are greasy AF, and he pats Kerr in his hair, and Kerr could feel the oils in his hair. And after they eat, you would think Hogg would like tip the waiter, tip the waitress, because he just earned some freaking money, he just earned some buck, you know, from his freaking job. But nah, bruh, what he did is piss on the freaking seat and left. So they have another job again, and he recruits his friends, Hogg's friends, which I don't know their names because 2 of the friends, they're being called as racial slurs, so not gonna say those. The other one is, I think, Dennis is the name, and they meet at this bar, and we know firsthand that Dennis is a chronic masturbator, okay? He faps a lot. And so this second act is just them and their friends sexually abusing and raping women and their kids, basically children, okay? And so Kerr, being the sea sucker, he joins them. He eats ass, he sucks the D, and he drinks some C. They drink some piss, and he also, for some freaking reason, he likes sucking on Hogg's toenails and fingernails, which he describes as really salty. Oh my gosh, there's a freaking lightning. Really salty and has a lot of soil on his fingernails, and he likes to eat them. Just gonna say that. Obviously, they go around gang raping women, raping children, and so obviously they take off their clothes. So Dennis looks at his friend, Hogg's friend, and he notices that his friend has a piercing on his D. And Dennis like,
I gotta get into that. That looks kinda cool.
so he takes Kerr, pulls him away from their fiasco, and takes him into the kitchen. And Dennis finds a freaking nail. A nail? He pushes it on his D, which obviously there's all blood spurting out of the D, and instructs Kerr to stop the bleeding by sucking on the D with blood pouring on it. So obviously the wound wouldn't stop bleeding because it's obviously a nail, a thick freaking nail. So he's like, this isn't a piercing, this isn't a ring, you know? So what he did with the nail is he bends it, double the pain, bends it, and forms it into a freaking piercing. A plus on arts and crafts, okay? A plus on arts and freaking crafts. So they finished the jobs. I believe they raided 3 houses, 3 women's on the course of this night. And it's just one night, mind you. So they go back into the bar and they have a beer, and we find out after the piercing that Dennis doesn't feel good. Obviously, he has like a fever, and he's just saying, I'm alright, I'm alright, I'm alright. He always says, I'm alright. So Kerr joins 2 of Hogg's friends on a joyride with their motorbike. Little did he know, he is being sold as, guess what? A freaking prostitute. And he's being sold at the gang bike leader that we met on the first act, who freaking likes Kerr, by the way, because he's good at sucking. And this gang leader has a daughter, and what do you know, he raped the daughter obliges. Yeah, he's being sold as a prostitute, and there is this one freaking scene where the bike gang leader instructs freaking Kerr to eat his ass, and Kerr, being the obedient child that he is, obliges. And basically the bike gang leader sharded, and Kerr is being instructed to eat the freaking turd, basically. And that's the gist of the second act. On the third act, it is reported that Dennis has been going around rampage and killing just people. Basically, he's storming into people's houses and shooting them with a shotgun. That's the third act. And so Kerr gets away from the bike gang's house because the bike gang is asleep, and for some freaking reason he misses the one that he loves the most, which is Hogg. And so he goes out onto the forest, and he witnesses the bike gang leader's neighbors. And both of those neighbors are freaking gay. And so, guess what they did? Again, they take turns and freaking the kid Kerr. And on top of that, a cop notices. And he's like,
What the frick are you doing with a child? You know that you could get arrested with what you're doing with that child? Let me have a piece of that.
why is this book being published? And who the frick read this book? Well, I read it. I want to have a chat how these author could formulate a plot like this. And so, finishing the third act, Dennis goes around rampage killing anyone. Kerr meets with Hogg. They have a little reunion, but I didn't fall for it. I think the author wanted me to have like,
Yay, Hogg and Kerr reunion.
but no, bro, no, freaking no. Hogg killed a lot of people, and so Dennis kills a freaking baby. And so I think the ending was like Hogg protects Dennis and hides Dennis in his car, and they walk around, and I think that's the end. Thank freaking Peter, it ended. I survived that freaking book. I suggest you don't read that book. It's just depravity for depravity's sake. And once I finished reading that on Goodreads, I felt weird rating it A star, so didn't freaking rate it. So the next book that I read is Naomi's Room, and thank God this has a freaking plot. I rated this 4 stars. In terms of disturbing, right? I wouldn't call this disturbing because Hogg set the freaking tone. But in this one, I would say that some people might consider the ending disturbing, but for me, Hogg wrecked me. So, Naomi's Room was like an ABC for me. Okay, so on Naomi's Room, there's this freaking couple, Charles and Laura, and on Christmas Eve, Charles was with their daughter, and they're on the mall, and then for some freaking reason, once he turned back, his daughter was gone, and his daughter was missing for 2 or 3 days until they discovered their daughter's remains, their daughter's clothes, and we believe that their daughter had been killed, and they are freaking grieving. But for some reason, they feel in their house that Naomi's still alive. Their daughter Naomi's still alive. They could hear Naomi. They could freaking see her in their photographs. Kinda weird and kinda creepy. So if you want a freaking creepy book, I wouldn't call this, well, I'd call this a kinda haunted house story. This family that deals with a lot of grief from their child, and I say it's pretty inventive and it creeped me the frick out. So if you want like a spooky story, pick this up. It's also freaking short. It only has 216 pages, but I flew through this book. Yeah, this pretty good horror book. It's pretty creepy because they've introduced photographs, which is pretty creepy in itself. Trigger warnings for child death, child abduction, loss, maybe. The next book that I've read is The Resurrectionist by James White. Now, I'm not gonna go into too much detail on this because this will be the first episode of my podcast, which is called the Cadaver Podcast, which I already announced. And so the plot of the Resurrectionist, there's another couple who meets their new neighbor. And for some freaking reason, they wake up every morning with a dream that their neighbor is raping and killing them. But how could that happen when they don't have any wounds to prove it? How could that happen when they're alive? So, yeah, that's the plot of The Resurrectionist. Watch out for my podcast. And I rated this 4 stars. This has got to be one of the most fun, that's so weird to say, but one of the most fun serial killer thriller book I've read. It's just the author just knows how to craft a freaking story from the point of view of the serial killer to the point of view of the victims and the point of view of the police. And this has got to be one of the most epic endings I've read in a while. So I've rated this 4 stars. Was it disturbing? Yeah. Was it Hogg? Freaking no. If I hadn't read Hogg, I'd say this might be one of the most disturbing on this list. One of the most, because the last book I read, it's pretty freaking bizarre. By the way, on The Resurrectionist, read that if you want to catch up before the podcast comes out, so we can discuss it there on the podcast, you know. Trigger warnings for rape, for sexual assault, those two. And so the next book that I read, this was recommended to me by a viewer. Shout out to you, Michael Phelps. He isn't the swimmer. Maybe he is. Maybe he's the swimmer. I don't know what you're doing in my channel, but thank you for watching. This was recommended by Michael S. Phelps. I'm gonna put the comment here. And this is The Exquisite Corpse by Poppy Z. Brite. Now, first off, I gotta say, I rated this 4 stars. This was pretty freaking good. Was it disturbing? Yes. But for some freaking reason, the writing was so beautifully done that the killings were like freaking art. You just have to read this book for yourself to know what I meant. And let me tell you, this book inspired a freaking art piece on my mind right now, and I'm freaking dying. See what I did there? To start on that art. So the synopsis, we follow 4 guys in this story. There's one serial killer who's called Andrew Compton. There's another one who's called Jay Byrne, which is also a serial killer. And Tran, who is a Vietnamese American runaway. He ran away from home. And Look, who is Tran's ex-boyfriend. And so you just have to read it for yourself how these 4 people meet. Let me say that this reminded me so much of true crime cases. There's one specific scene that involves a victim and some tourists that really is the exact same thing that happened to Jeffrey Dahmer and his victim. Do not quote me on this. This book was inspired by true crime cases, and so if you love freaking true crime, you'll like this book. What can I say about that book? The way Poppy described the killings on this book, so beautifully done. So trigger warnings for violence. There's necrophilia. There's cannibalism, rape, lots of talk about AIDS. So also, by the way, this book talks about AIDS back then, how AIDS has a stigma around gay people. This book tackles a lot on that. This book reminded me of this one movie that we watched in class back then, but it also talks about AIDS back then and how it affected the gay people back then, and how there's a stigma around that, and how that the virus, they don't know much about the virus back then. I literally thought Poppy was a guy, but turns out as a woman, and the fact that she could write guys so freaking well is like, hats off to you, girl. So yeah, that is Exquisite Corpse by Poppy Z. Brite. The last book that I freaking read has got to be just bizarre. I didn't understand this book. I've come across this book through Juan, Valencia. I didn't understand this book at all. The author must be on drugs while writing this, because even I, as like a highly imaginative person, couldn't fathom what happened in this freaking book. And this is Cows by Matthew Stokoe or Stokoe. I don't know even how to describe the synopsis of this book. Let me just say what I've read. There's like eating a lot of turds in this book. There's like talking cows. There's baby nailed to the wall. So, fun times, fun times. Let me just read the synopsis, okay? Maybe that'll help. Mother's corpse in bits, dead dog on the roof, girlfriend in a coma, baby nailed to the wall, 100 tons of homicidal beef stampeding through the tube system, and Steven thought the slaughterhouse was bad. That's the freaking synopsis on Goodreads. Even the synopsis doesn't even make sense. Trigger warnings for this book. This introduced a new trigger for this book, okay? Because I believe this book doesn't have rape. But this book introduced bestiality, so gotta give the book some credit because they introduced a new trigger. So yeah, triggers on bestiality, violence, lots of freaking violence, abortion. There's an abortion scene in this book, which that's pretty freaking disturbing. Not saying that abortion is disturbing, but the way it freaking happened in this book is pretty freaking vile. I wish I could unread Hogg. I wish I could burn Hogg in my mind. If you've read Hogg and finished Hogg, let's discuss it, because I want to know why that was published. Who the fork thought of that freaking story? I'd understand why Human Centipede was like greenlit, because that kinda has a plot in it, but Hogg? Bitch, Hogg. I really don't understand why that was published. So if you've read any of this book, let's discuss it, because I also wanted to discuss cows, because what the frick did I just read after reading the ending, which is pretty freaking epic, by the way. The ending was kind of epic, not gonna lie. That was freaking an epic scene. So yeah, I think this is it. Watch out for my podcast episode coming next week, or maybe next week. I don't know when I'm gonna film that, because I'm not the only one now in this house when filming. Can't believe I just described freaking Hogg while he's listening. That is it for this video. So yeah, bye.